It was barely 3 o'clock on a Friday afternoon, and I was already nursing 2 shots of Jack Daniels, bracing for what felt like the start of a terrible weekend. As a reporter for a small-town newspaper in the Midwest, I'd been grinding through late nights all week. My boss, noticing I was burnt out, had given me the afternoon off. After running a few errands, I headed home, looking forward to collapsing into my trusty lazy boy for some much-needed rest. But as I pulled into the driveway, I noticed something that made my stomach tighten. 2 cars parked out front. One was Irene's as expected. The other was unfamiliar. It wasn't like Irene to be home in the middle of the day. She worked as an actuary for a mid-sized insurance company and usually kept a strict 8 to 5 schedule. I tried to dismiss my unease. After 7 years of marriage, I had no reason to doubt her. I trusted her completely. Still, something about the situation didn't sit right. I unlocked the front door, still trying to shake off the uneasy feeling. The house was quiet at first, but as I stepped further inside, faint sounds drifted down from upstairs. They were unmistakable. Voices, laughter, and something far more intimate. I froze, my heart pounding. A creeping sense of dread filled me as the sounds grew louder. Taking the stairs 2 at a time, I reached the top and found the door to our bedroom slightly ajar. "Is this what you've been missing?" a deep voice asked, followed by a laugh. My breath caught in my throat as I processed what I was hearing. Peeking into the room, the scene before me shattered every ounce of trust I'd ever had. Irene, my wife, was with another man, someone I didn't recognize. The sight was enough to knock the wind out of me. "Don't mind me," I finally said, stepping into the room, my voice cutting through the air like a knife. Both of them froze, their faces a mix of shock and panic. Irene quickly scrambled to grab the sheets, stammering something about not wanting me to find out this way. "I wasn't supposed to find out this way," I repeated, my voice cold. "Then when exactly? On our anniversary, over breakfast?" The man finally stood, pulling a blanket around himself. Irene looked flustered, still trying to come up with an explanation, but I wasn't in the mood to listen. "Is this your attorney?" I asked flatly, gesturing toward him. Irene nodded, her face pale. "Perfect," I muttered. Without another word, I walked to the closet, grabbed my gym bag, and started packing a few clothes. Irene tried to explain, but I waved her off. "I'll come back for the rest of my things later," I said as I zipped the bag shut. "Expect divorce papers soon." I walked out of the house without another glance, throwing my bag into the truck and driving straight to the Ironwood pub. It wasn't the first place I thought I'd go after discovering my marriage was over, but it was familiar, and I needed somewhere to think. The bar was mostly empty, as it usually was on a Friday afternoon. I took a seat at the counter, my mind racing. The betrayal stung worse than I thought possible, and my trust in Irene felt like a distant memory. Looking back, maybe I should have seen the signs. At her last work event, her coworkers barely acknowledged me, and Irene didn't seem to care. On the way home, I brought it up, but she brushed it off, blaming the alcohol. I thought we'd moved past it. Now, as I sat there staring into a glass of whiskey, the reality of it all hit me. I knew I had to figure out my next steps, finding a new place, moving money out of our joint account. But at that moment, I didn't have the energy. I just wanted to sit there and forget for a little while. Tomorrow could wait. Irene and I first crossed paths at a prominent Midwestern university where we started dating during our junior year and stayed together through graduation. By the time I proposed, it was clear that unless I managed to secure a position at a leading newspaper, Irene would inevitably be the main breadwinner. But we had an agreement. Our resources and successes would belong to us both, shared equally, or so I believed. Somewhere along the way, her respect for me faded, likely influenced by her ambitious colleagues. As for her love, what happened today made it painfully clear how far I'd fallen in her eyes. When Zane, my regular bartender, started his shift at 4 o'clock, he seemed surprised to see me so early. I gave him a brief rundown of the day's events, keeping the details to a minimum, and handed him my truck keys. "Don't give these back until I'm done drinking for the night," I saw what I told him. I didn't care where I ended up sleeping as long as I wasn't behind the wheel. "Man, that's rough," Zane said, shaking his head. "Finding out like that." By the time 9 p.m. rolled around, I was thoroughly numb, emotionally and physically. That's when a state trooper entered the bar, scanning the room before heading straight for Zane. After a quick word, he approached me with a calm, deliberate stride, the kind of walk that seemed practiced. "You Derek White?" he asked, his voice steady but cautious. I nodded, barely registering his presence. I've got some difficult news to share. He hesitated, as if searching for the gentlest way to say it. Your wife, Irene White, and a Mr. Hugo Reed were killed in a car accident about 3 hours ago. A semi-truck ran a red light and collided with their BMW convertible. We've been trying to locate you, but it took some time for someone to suggest checking here. His words hit me like a bucket of ice water, but my reaction wasn't what he expected. Throwing my arms in the air, I shouted, "Drinks are on me! There is a God after all!" A cheer erupted around the bar, and the trooper's expression turned to one of utter disbelief. He looked as though he'd just witnessed a ghost. "Mr. White," he began cautiously, "I understand this must be a shock." "Shock?" I slurred, laughing bitterly. "This is the best news I've had all year. I walked in on those two in my bed this afternoon. I was planning to leave her. Frankly, officer, this couldn't have worked out better." The trooper, who later introduced himself as Reginald Masters, shifted uncomfortably and exchanged a glance with Zane. "Normally, we'd ask the next of kin to identify the bodies," he said, "but I'm guessing you're in no shape for that tonight. Zane, can you make sure he knows to come to the morgue tomorrow?" Zane nodded, but even through the haze of alcohol, I understood the weight of what had just been said. Still, anger from Irene's betrayal overshadowed any lingering affection. In that moment, I felt nothing but relief. The next morning, I woke up aching in the cramped cab of my truck. Dragging myself into the bar, I retrieved my keys from Zane and briefly considered checking into a hotel. But the trooper's words came flooding back, and instead, I decided to face the empty house that once felt like home. Stepping through the door, memories of 9 shared years, 7 of them as husband and wife, rushed over me. Yet grief never came. Relief was all I could muster. After showering and dressing, I made my way to the morgue. Irene's body was unrecognizable, mangled from the collision. Hugo didn't look much better. Somewhere in the back of my mind, I hoped his end had been slow, but I'd never know for sure. Returning home, I prepared for the phone calls I dreaded most, first to my parents, then to Irene's, and finally, to her sister Julia. Irene's parents, Felix and Elise Jenkins, were wonderful people, kind and generous. Breaking the news to them was heart-wrenching. No parent should have to endure losing a child, and despite everything Irene had done, I couldn't deny the sadness I felt for them. But as for Irene herself, my mind replayed the image of her, tangled with Hugo in our bed. Any sorrow I might have felt was replaced by cold indifference. I made a choice then. I would handle the practicalities, report the facts, and keep my emotions out of it. For Felix and Elise's sake, I would do what needed to be done. But mourning Irene? That wasn't something I could fake. The first call was to my parents. My mom, always quick to show her emotions, broke into tears almost immediately. My dad, on the other hand, approached the situation with his usual practicality, asking for details. I explained that Irene had been in the car with Hugo Reed when the accident happened. "Who's Hugo Reed?" Dad asked, his voice sharp. I knew the question was coming, but it still made me pause. My hesitation must have said plenty. "He's an attorney," I answered finally, "a friend of Irene's." Dad didn't miss a beat. "And why was she in a car with this attorney friend instead of being home with you?" It was time to face the truth head on. "Because she wasn't with me anymore, Dad. I walked in on them earlier today. They were together in our bed. I packed a bag and left. As for why they were out driving later, I guess they figured they didn't need to hide anymore." There was a brief silence before Dad spoke again, his voice subdued. "I'm sorry, son." By then, Mom had pulled herself together enough to rejoin the conversation. "Derek, are you absolutely sure? That's not something you should say unless you're certain." I cut her off, my voice firmer than I intended. "Mom, I saw it with my own eyes. I know exactly what I saw." Dad shifted gears to practical matters. "Have you spoken to Felix and Elise yet? How are you going to break this to them?" "I'll keep it simple," I said. "Unless they press me for details, I won't lie, but I'm not going to make things worse for them either." Dad's tone took on a warning edge. "Be careful how you handle this, son. They're grieving parents, and they deserve respect." "Yes, sir," I replied, though the words felt heavier than usual. The call to Irene's parents followed a similar script. Elise, her mother, was heartbroken, crying so hard that she could barely speak. Felix, however, picked up on the key detail immediately. Irene had been in the car with another man. "Derek, is there something you're not telling us?" he asked, his voice tight with suspicion. Elise's sobs echoed in the background. "Why wasn't she with you at 6 o'clock on a Friday?" I couldn't hold back anymore. "Fine, Felix. You want the truth? Irene was cheating on me. I caught her with Hugo in our bed earlier today. After that, I packed up and left. I guess once I was gone, they didn't feel the need to hide." "You caught them in your house?" Felix's disbelief was clear. The weight of his daughter's betrayal hit him hard. "Yes," I confirmed, my voice strained with exhaustion and anger. "In my house. And to be honest, Felix, as terrible as this sounds, I'm relieved they're both gone. They got exactly what they deserved." I regretted those words the moment they left my mouth, but there was no taking them back. Felix's disbelief turned to anger, and he began yelling at me through the phone. I cut him off, lowering my voice but keeping it firm. "Felix, that man mocked me while he was in bed with your daughter. And Irene, she was right there with him, egging him on. That's who she was. I'm done. This saves me the trouble of a divorce. She won't be buried in my family's plot, and I'll be damned if I spend eternity next to her. Just tell me which funeral home you want her sent to. I'll handle the logistics, but you and Elise can take care of the rest. I won't be there." Felix tried a different approach, softening his tone. "You can't just erase her from your life, Derek. You were together for nearly a decade. That doesn't just disappear." "It already has," I said coldly. "The moment I saw her with Hugo, it was over." "Why should her death change anything?" His voice dropped to a whisper. "Someday, with time, you might feel differently. You might regret not saying goodbye." I shook my head, my tone just as quiet but unyielding. "I doubt it, Felix. I really do." The funeral took place at Felix and Elise's church, the same one where Irene and I had once stood, pledging before God and our families to love, honor, and cherish each other for life. The bitter irony wasn't lost on me. I considered attending for all of 10 seconds, but the thought quickly evaporated, overtaken by the seething anger within me. Have you ever wanted to rage against someone who's already gone? That's exactly how I felt. My presence might have provided some solace to Irene's grieving parents, but for me, it would have been like pouring gasoline on an already raging fire. I had enough fury to deal with as it was. About an hour after I figured the service had ended, my phone rang. It was Irene's sister, Julia. I braced myself, knowing this wasn't going to be a friendly chat. Odds were, her parents hadn't told her the full story. "You're exactly what Irene said you were. A worthless piece of trash," Julia spat, venom dripping from her words. "You're a small man with small dreams and an even smaller future, writing pointless stories for some no-name paper. I've always wondered why it took Irene so long to cheat on you." "Well, hello to you too, Julia," I said, keeping my tone calm despite the storm brewing inside me. "So, you knew about her cheating? Interesting. Then why do you care whether I showed up at her funeral?" "Because you humiliated my parents, you spineless loser," she shot back. "Do you know how embarrassing it was for them to explain why their son-in-law wasn't there? Everyone was asking, and you made them look like fools." That was it. My patience snapped. "Oh, I'm right there with you, Julia," I yelled. "I felt the same way about your sainted sister and her boyfriend after I found them in my bed, but guess what? I got lucky. They're both dead now. So why don't you do us all a favor, go to hell, and leave me alone?" I hung up, my heart pounding. That conversation had gone about as well as expected. With Julia's tirade out of the way, I turned my focus to the house. I called a realtor and put it on the market immediately. I moved into the spare bedroom, refusing to sleep in the master suite ever again. The bedroom furniture, sheets, and pillows, every single thing from that room, were sold off for pennies. There was no way I could keep anything that held memories of Irene's betrayal. Her personal belongings were another matter. I sold her jewelry, most of it gifts I had bought for her over the years, and donated the proceeds to a church food pantry. Her clothes and other personal effects were packed into boxes and dropped off at her parents' house. Among them were our wedding album and the usual collection of couple photos. I didn't need those anymore. The only image I couldn't shake was the one burned into my memory, her and Hugo tangled in my bed. That was all the reminder I needed. Felix met me at the door when I arrived with the boxes. We worked quietly, unloading them into their house with minimal conversation. When we finished, the three of us, Felix, Elise, and I, stood together for a brief, awkward moment. Then, almost instinctively, we moved in for a hug. It was short but heartfelt. And though none of us said it, I think we were all holding back tears. "Take care," I whispered, my voice barely audible as I turned to leave. In the first 2 weeks after Irene's death, everything moved in a blur. Selling the house, making difficult phone calls, and clearing out the remnants of our life together. Amid the chaos, I received a call from Riverside Insurance Group. I knew what it was about before I even picked up. Irene and I had long maintained life insurance policies, something we'd discussed many times. Since it was her area of expertise, I had left most of the decisions to her. One of those decisions had been a $1 million life insurance policy on each of us, with a double indemnity clause for accidental death before the age of 45. That meant Irene's death would result in a $2 million payout. The thought hadn't crossed my mind in the chaos of the past few weeks, but when I returned the call to the agent, I nearly spit out my coffee at what they said next. The insurance agent explained that since the truck driver was at fault for the accident, his company would likely be held liable for a wrongful death settlement. She advised me to push for a settlement of at least $2 million, though she believed $3 million to $4 million was more realistic. After factoring in legal fees, I stood to bank around $5 million. When it was all said and done, I walked away with $4.75 million after the lawyer took his cut. Not that it mattered much. I was still too numb to care. The trucking company also settled with Hugo Reed's widow, and we were scheduled to finalize the paperwork at the same time. I had never met her before, and when I did, I was caught off guard. While Irene had always been striking, Tessa Reed was equally stunning, perhaps even more so. I couldn't help but wonder why Hugo would risk everything for an affair. Maybe he thought he was invincible. Most people do until they're not. After signing the papers, Tessa invited me out for coffee. Curious but hesitant, I agreed, figuring she had something more to say. Once we sat down, she wasted no time getting to the point. "My husband never mentioned anyone named Irene White," she said, her voice steady but sharp. "And after checking, I found out she wasn't a client of his firm. No one there seems to know who she was, or if they do, they're not telling me. So, what was your wife to my husband, Mr. White?" Her bluntness caught me off guard. I took a long sip of coffee, stalling for time as I tried to decide how much to tell her. She picked up on my hesitation immediately. "That bad?" she asked, her expression tightening. I couldn't avoid it any longer. I told her everything, walking in on Irene and Hugo, the fallout, and how it had all played out. Her face hardened as she listened, the revulsion evident in her eyes. By the time I finished, I felt as if I'd gone through the whole ordeal again. "Thank you for being honest," she said quietly, then stood and left without another word. Even with the windfall from the settlement, my life felt hollow. Money didn't matter. I had no interest in dating, no excitement for anything. I rented a small, dingy one-bedroom apartment just to have a place to sleep. My social life dwindled to almost nothing, but I didn't care. I kept working at the newspaper, rode my bike occasionally, and spent time at the gym. Beyond that, I was merely existing. Eventually, my dad convinced me to see a therapist. The diagnosis? Trust issues, naturally. The therapist encouraged me to reconnect with people and try to rebuild my life. I humored them for one session, but I never went back. It felt like a waste of time. One night, as I sat in my apartment half watching a baseball game, Julia's words from after the funeral came back to me. She had called me a small man with small dreams, writing small stories for a small newspaper. Harsh as it was, she wasn't wrong. I had taken the job to stay close to Irene, always planning to move on to something bigger, but now there was nothing holding me back. I didn't need to work anymore if I didn't want to. For the first time in years, I realized I was free to write whatever I wanted without caring who might read it. The next day, I walked into the office and handed my boss, Todd, my 2 weeks' notice. That evening, I sat in my apartment, staring at my modest bookshelf. Of the 30 or so books I owned, only 2 were fiction. One of them was Moby Dick. It got me thinking. Always a dangerous pastime for someone like me. My mind works in spirals, twisting ideas and following random tangents, much to the frustration of anyone trying to follow my conversations. 10 minutes later, it hit. Irene was my white whale. I couldn't bring her down in real life, but I could do it on paper. That realization sparked something in me. For the first time since everything had fallen apart, I felt alive. I sat down at my computer and started writing my first piece of fiction since middle school. In that story, the Hugo character met a grim end, and the Irene character faced the brutal consequences of her actions. It took me 2 days to write, edit, and polish the story, and when I finished, it was like a weight had been lifted. I couldn't exact revenge in the real world, but through my stories, I could. Over the next 2 months, I wrote 17 more short stories. In each one, Hugo's character met a grim fate, and Irene's character received her due. Each completed piece brought a sense of satisfaction I hadn't felt in years. It was cathartic. One day, I glanced at my copy of Moby Dick, its pages worn and familiar. It was a tangible creation, something I could hold. That's when the thought struck me I could do that too. 6 months later, I finished my first novel. Oddly enough, it was a historical romance. Naturally, the Hugo character met a vicious end, and the Irene character was humbled yet again. I thought the book was decent, and apparently a publisher agreed. The deal wasn't anything to write home about, but at least I didn't have to pay to self-publish. It was a start. Against all odds, my first book took off. Readers seemed to connect with the raw emotions I'd poured into the story. Whether it was my catharsis or their shared sense of justice, it struck a chord. The publisher printed 2 additional runs, and soon they were asking for a second book, doubling the money to sweeten the deal. I thought, why not? This time, I wrote a murder mystery. Predictably, the Hugo character met a grim end, and the Irene character faced justice, this time in jail. Finishing that second book felt like reclaiming another piece of myself. The strong sales didn't hurt either. It felt as though readers were cheering me on, agreeing that Irene and Hugo deserved every punishment I dished out in fiction. Not long after, another publisher approached me with an attractive 3-book deal. Though the money was tempting, I gave my original publisher the first chance to match it. They did, and over the next 18 months, I delivered 3 more books. The stories followed a familiar formula. Hugo's character met his end, and Irene's paid for her betrayal. For variety, I added humor to the 3rd installment. Each book was a hit, but more importantly, they helped me process the mess my life had become. The truth was, I knew I'd never get real answers to why Irene had done what she did. Writing was the only closure I could hope for. It became my way of coping, a private form of revenge disguised as fiction. Then came another 3-book deal, this one with double the payout. But the biggest news wasn't the money. It was the movie studio's interest. They wanted to adapt at least 2 of the books into feature films and offered me a hefty payday to assist with the screenplays. I agreed without hesitation. Things took an even wilder turn when my 6th book was chosen for Oprah's book club. Though I'd never been a fan, I couldn't deny her influence. Overnight, my career skyrocketed. Suddenly, I wasn't just a successful author. I was a recognizable name. Fame had its downsides. Now, some people seemed eager to tear me down just for the fun of it, but I didn't let it bother me. Truth be told, I wasn't particularly impressed with myself either. And if someone gave me a hard time, I wasn't afraid to be blunt right back. One Friday evening, I found myself at my usual spot, the Ironwood Pub, nursing a glass of Jack Daniels. Despite my newfound wealth, which now exceeded $10 million, I still enjoyed simple pleasures, a strong drink, staying fit, and occasionally indulging in flings with beautiful women. My apartment was still the same small, run-down 1-bedroom, and I didn't feel the need to upgrade. The regulars at the bar largely left me alone. If they knew about my writing, they didn't make a big deal out of it. Frankly, I doubted many of them read at all, which suited me just fine. Zane, my favorite bartender, knew about my success, but he never made a fuss. I made sure to tip him well, a silent agreement to keep things low-key. That night, I was lost in thought, barely paying attention to the game on TV, when 2 women sat down next to me. Both were attractive, casually dressed in jeans and tops, clearly not trying to impress anyone. Still, something about the woman sitting farther from me struck me as familiar. Then she spoke, and it hit me. "You don't remember me, do you, Mr. White?" she said, leaning forward as her friend gave us space to talk. At first I didn't, but as soon as she spoke again, it clicked. Tessa Reed, Hugo's widow. The last time I'd seen her was at the settlement signing after the trucking company had paid us for the deaths of our cheating spouses. That day, I'd confirmed what she probably already suspected, that her husband had been unfaithful with my wife. "I most certainly do remember you, Mrs. Reed," I said with a small smile. It just took me a moment. "How have you been? You're looking great, if you don't mind me saying." Tessa's cheeks flushed slightly as she glanced at her friend, then turned back to meet my gaze. "I'm much better than I was the last time you saw me," Tessa said, her voice calm but sincere. "And I honestly have you to thank for that, at least emotionally. Hugo's death left me with about $2 million, but it also left me a wreck. Losing him like that was hard enough, but then finding out he'd been cheating on me? That was unbearable. I was furious that I'd never get the chance to confront him, to make him face what he'd done. Then one day, Brooke brought me your first book. She recognized your name from the settlement meeting and thought I'd find it interesting. At first I skimmed it, realizing it was about our spouses. But soon I was hooked. When Hugo's character got killed off, I can't even describe the relief I felt. And when Irene got what she deserved, it felt like justice. Like I finally had some closure. It was the first time I'd felt good since everything happened. Since then, I've read every book you've written. It might sound silly, but they've become my therapy. I even giggle every time Hugo and Irene get what's coming to them. That's pretty much how I feel when I finish writing one, I replied with a smile. I'm glad the books helped you too. Judging by how well they've sold, I think a lot of people relate to what we've been through. Honestly, I never imagined myself as a writer. I hadn't written fiction since 8th grade, but maybe because I wasn't doing it for the money, thanks to the settlement and insurance, it all just flowed out of me. I'll keep going as long as it feels right. We moved to a nearby table where I ordered a couple of snack trays. Our conversation stretched late into the evening, flowing easily as we shared stories and laughed. When the clock neared midnight, Tessa and Brooke decided it was time to call it a night. As they got up to leave, I said, I can't remember the last time I had such a good time. Let's do this again soon. How about next Friday night? Dinner's on me this time, I suggested. They both agreed and we made plans. The following Friday, we met at my favorite Italian restaurant. Just like before, we had an incredible evening. Tessa with her long blonde hair, striking blue eyes and curvy figure, and Brooke with her sleek black hair and athletic frame drew plenty of attention. Brooke's fitted skirt, which showed off her toned legs, definitely turned a few heads. To be honest, I couldn't help but feel a little smug having the two most attractive women in the room sitting at my table. It was surreal, and let's face it, I loved every second of it. After a fantastic meal, I noticed the waiting area of the restaurant had become crowded. Not wanting to hold up the table for others, I suggested we head to a nearby club for a drink. Brooke decided to call it a night, but I offered to drive Tessa home afterward. We ended up at Stella's, a cozy little bar that wasn't too crowded. The quiet atmosphere made it easy to talk. Leaning in with a playful grin, I asked, "So, who won tonight? Did the winner get me, or was it the loser?" Tessa blushed, clearly caught off guard. "I was the winner, I hope," she said softly. "I think I'm the winner," I replied with a laugh. "I was the moment you both sat down with me. Every guy in that restaurant wanted to deck me for hogging the two prettiest women there." Her blush deepened, and we shared a warm, lingering smile. Then her expression shifted, growing serious. "Can I tell you something?" she asked, her nose scrunching slightly. "And you have to promise you won't get mad." I nodded cautiously, unsure of what was coming next. "I absolutely hated you after we signed those settlement papers," Tessa admitted, her voice steady but laced with vulnerability. "I knew it wasn't your fault Hugo cheated on me with Irene, but knowing you'd found out before I did, it felt like you were one step ahead, holding on to something I didn't have. I wasn't handling it well. With everything else going on, it felt like you had your closure while I was left in the dark." "I picked up on that vibe," I replied, "and I get it. The idea of us coming together after what our spouses did? That's not real life. That's a Hallmark movie cliche. So I let you walk away without even saying goodbye." Tessa nodded. Then, about a year later, Brooke gave me your book. I opened it out of curiosity, realizing pretty quickly it was about the affair. It felt like someone had opened a window and let the light in. When Hugo's character met his end, I can't describe the relief I felt. And when Irene got what she deserved, it was like I'd found a piece of justice for myself. My therapist noticed the change immediately. At my next session, I gave him the book. He read it and said, and I quote, "This guy's a genius." I chuckled. If I'm such a genius, why am I living in a hole-in-the-wall apartment with over $10 million in the bank? Her eyes widened. I knew about the settlement and insurance, but I didn't realize you were doing that well. Why are you living like this? Because when you're alone and don't trust anyone, money doesn't mean much, I admitted with a shrug. I don't need a lot to get by. I don't have big vices, and I don't have anyone to share my life or my money with. Saying it out loud hit me harder than I expected. It was like ripping off a bandage and realizing the wound was still raw. For the first time, I fully grasped how hollow my life had become. I'd been living in a bubble of my own making, seeking revenge against Irene and Hugo through stories while shutting the rest of the world out. It was satisfying, but it wasn't living. As I stared into the middle distance, lost in thought, I suddenly felt a spark of electricity. Tessa leaned in and kissed me, her lips urgent yet tender. The intensity of her kiss broke through my numbness, and I kissed her back with a hunger I hadn't felt in years. For 30 perfect seconds, the world faded away. When we finally pulled apart, she locked eyes with me and whispered, "You need to pay the tab and take me back to your place." Still dazed, I did just that. In the years since Irene's death, I'd had my share of flings, but this was different. It wasn't about distraction or fleeting pleasure. I hadn't truly connected with anyone since losing my wife. And I knew from our conversations that Tessa had kept things casual since Hugo's death too. That night, we took our time, exploring each other with care and curiosity as if learning a new language. Every touch, every kiss felt deliberate, like we were rediscovering what intimacy meant. Eventually, she broke the silence. I get it, all of it, and all I can say is, if you let me in, if you trust me, I'll prove every day that I'm worthy of it. I smiled. If that's a proposal, I accept. No, we didn't rush to the altar after that night, but it was the beginning of something real. Over the next year, we worked through our personal baggage together, helping each other heal from the scars left by our previous marriages. Eventually, we tied the knot. We built a beautiful house in the country with 5 bedrooms, one for us, one for each of the 4 kids we planned to have, and a guest suite for visitors. As for my writing, something shifted once I started dating Tessa. I no longer felt the need to punish Irene and Hugo in my stories, though I kept writing them because they were still fun to craft, and readers loved them. My publisher's accountants were especially happy, and so was I. Life had given me a second chance, and I wasn't about to waste it. The karma train had been good to me, and this time, I was happy to bring along a few passengers for the ride.